Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wahdahu la sharika lahu wa ashhadu anna Muhammadan abduhu wa rasuluh. Amma ba'du fa'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. Huwallahul khaliqul bari'ul musawwir lahul asma'ul husna yusabbihu lahu ma fis samawati wal ard wa huwal azizul hakim. Respected Chairman Sahib and elders and dear brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. First of all, I just wanted to extend my gratitude to the associations for putting this wonderful event together at such a grand scale and with so much detail, and also thank you for your hospitality, and also for inviting this humble one to speak briefly on this topic. I won't take up too much time. There's a phrase, speaking of ears and eyes, that we're blessed with 2 eyes, 2 ears, and 1 mouth, and that is because we can hear and see twice as much as we speak. So the lesson in that is that we should hear and see more and speak less. So I will present a little bit on this topic, and then hopefully we can discuss more offline later. It's a very vast subject. So in the verse I just recited in chapter 59, Allah talks about His attributes. And He says, He is the creator, the maker, the fashioner. His are the most beautiful names. All that is in the heavens and the earth glorifies Him, and He is the mighty, the wise. So as we know, there are 99 attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. As Sadr Sahib, Ahmadiyya Medical Scientist Association mentioned Shafi as one of the attributes. And these attributes are there for us to reflect and also recognize Allah. To prove that He exists, we reflect on His signs. And in my humble submission, this particular verse points to, in some ways, the human eye. And I will hope to convince you about that in my talk today. So the 3 attributes that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about are Khaliq, Bari, and Fashioner, and Musawir. So Khaliq means the one who creates. And we, in Dr. Rafi Sahib's talk, we saw the verse in chapter 23 where Allah specifically talks about the creation of man in meticulous detail. And this embryogenesis has been proven by science from what was revealed 1400 years ago. And then the concept of evolution, as Dr. Rafi mentioned, there is one school of thought that says everything just created, which is creationism, which we don't believe in. And then then there's a school of thought that says everything was due to random chance or natural selection, and then there was no intelligent designer behind it, which we also don't subscribe to. But Allah Ta'ala says that He is Bari, He is the maker, He actually evolves organisms. So we do believe in evolution, but it's through the design of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then Allah points to very specific creations. He says, I've created man, I've evolved man, but specifically I've created organs within man for you to recognize Him. And Hazrat Khalifah Masih Sani anhu, in commentary on this specific term, Musawir, says Allah is saying that He's the giver of final touches to things that He has created, final touches to things. So this brings us to the human eye. In my biased opinion, I think the human eye is the most fascinating structure in the body. In fact, complexity-wise, it's the second most complex structure of the brain. The human eye has 2 million working parts. You think of a camera like a 6 megapixel camera or 12 megapixel camera. Now they have these amazing companies that are creating 50 and 100 megapixel cameras. The human eye is a 576 megapixel camera. It can differentiate 10 million different colors. And 80% of the memories that we have are determined by what we see. The iris itself has 256 unique characteristics. By comparison, the fingerprint, which is used for identification, has 40. And that's why you see iris recognition as a way to identify the uniqueness of human beings. And then interestingly, the human eye is complex, but also the eye itself is Allah's such a fascinating creation that it's complex among other organisms as well. For example, some species of jellyfish have 24 eyes. A scorpion has 12 eyes. There are creations of Allah Ta'ala that have no eyes. For example, the earthworm. There are creations of eyes that don't move, like the owl. It has a large eye, but it actually doesn't have muscles that allow it to move, so it has to move its head. And there's wisdom and design in all of that. The picture you see, on a side note, is the earliest known description, medical description of the human eye, and this was by Hunan ibn Ishaq in the 9th century. And there's a whole separate discussion and talk, inshallah, that we can have one day on Islamic and Muslim contributions to optics and ophthalmology. So this brings us to revelation, rationality, knowledge, and truth, which is the segment that we're talking about today, that how can we reflect on Allah's signs and prove that Allah exists? So I'll just go through a little bit of background about that, because for ages, people have tried to understand, does God really exist? And they look at his creation and say, okay, this will convince us that God exists. There was one philosopher and theologist, William Paley, in 1820, who said that if you look at the eye, you cannot help but be convinced that there is an intelligent creator. And then about 3 decades later, we are all familiar with the advent of Charles Darwin. He was a very smart man, and he came up with the concept of natural selection, as we just heard from Dr. Rafi. But one interesting thing about what Darwin wrote in his Origin of Species, he talks about how there's probably nobody behind the animals that we see. It may be all through the random chance and natural selection, but there is a footnote in what he writes, and he says that I admit and I confess to the highest degree that I cannot explain the human eye. That's what keeps me up at night. So in other words, the person who invented the concept of natural selection is admitting that the human eye has left him confounded. How can something this complex be due to natural chance? Incidentally, I found this quote from Hazrat Khalifatul Masih Sani, Radiyallahu anhu, Hazrat Muslim Maud, who said, suppose that man came into being on his own. How do we then assume that the entire world was automatically built in accordance with the needs of man? Take the example of the human eye. In order for the eye to function properly, we find the presence of the sun 149 million kilometers away. Without the sun, human beings would not have been able to use their eyes for any good purpose. Again, Hazrat Khalifatul Masih Sani is pointing us to the design of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So now, there's a whole discussion we can have about evolution and how we can perhaps convince ourselves that even something as complex as the human eye maybe came out by random chance. You can actually convince a scientist that there perhaps is an explanation for that. But I'll just tackle one angle to this, and that is, those who are critical of this concept of God's design will say that if God designed things, then everything has to be perfect, right? And if there are flaws in a design and you believe God is perfect, then you have to admit that God didn't design it. And so all of their focus is now on the human eye, that if we can explain to people who believe in God that there are flaws in the design of the human eye, then we can destroy their whole foundation of understanding how God exists. And I'll give you the example of Richard Dawkins, who's a famous author, and he supports the idea of evolution, and he says that the universe existed without the creation of a designer. And you know, people talk about a watchmaker, that a watchmaker makes an intricate watch, and they will give the analogy that the eye is like a watch that's very complex. How can that be created randomly? So Richard Dawkins, he refutes this theory, and then he says that if you look at the eye, there's a flaw in the design of the eye. He says that if you look at the wiring of the eye, when light enters the eye, it first lands on all of the wires, but they're in front of the optic nerve. It's a terrible design, and he says the principle of this thing would offend any tidy-minded engineer. In other words, what he's saying is everything has been created in reverse, and there's a flaw. And then there's several other scientists and philosophers who have said the same thing. George Williams, Douglas Fatumia, Jerry Coyne. All of these folks are saying that there are different flaws within the human eye. It's stupidly designed. It's not the design of an intelligent engineer, and there's flaws in it. For example, they'll say that the optic nerve, where it inserts into the back of the eye, it creates a blind spot. So he said, why would God create something where there's actually a blind spot in your vision? And so there's a flaw in that design as well. Well, Allah Ta'ala, as we know, is the best of designers, and every criticism about the flaw in the human eye has been responded by scientists, and I'll just tackle a few. For example, this whole concept of what we call inverted design, where the wiring is in the front of the optic nerve, the retina is in front of the optic nerve rather than behind it. The analogy would be like if you go inside of your car and instead on the dashboard you see the dash, you actually see all the wires that are behind the dash. It wouldn't really make much sense. But actually there's a lot of wisdom in the design of having an opposite a setup of the human eye where the wiring is in the front, because we now know that when light enters the eye and it goes through that circuitry, which is the rods and cones that then feed into the optic nerve, that's not where all of the processing ends. As the neuroscientists in this audience can appreciate, visual processing happens after light enters the eye. As Dr. Rafi beautifully said, that if you don't have certain chemicals in the brain or neurotransmitters, then your eyes are obsolete. And we now know that the design of the eye is such that if you have the wiring in the front and then you allow those photons of light then to go from the optic nerve through the lateral geniculate and then back to the occipital cortex, you have the optimal way of visual processing. And that's why we have the design that we have. And this is what scientists support. Secondly, people are critical and they say that there are blood vessels in front of the retina and they can bleed and they can cause all sorts of problems. What kind of design was that? But we now know from scientists that if you have blood vessels within the retina, then that's the proper way to nourish the retina. And if you look at the retina, the central part of the retina, which is where all of the concentration of vision goes to, which is what we call the fovea, it has the least amount of blood vessels. So if there is bleeding and things like that, Allah has protected the fovea in that way, whereas blood vessels are in the outer part of the retina. So that again is the design of Allah, that you nourish the circuitry of the eye by putting blood vessels within the retina, not behind it or not in front of it. And then this whole concept of a blind spot. Well, yes, each eye does have a blind spot, and those who criticize this idea that God has created the eye, they say that why is there a blind spot in the vision? But the way Allah Ta'ala has created the eye, that the blind spot is not in the center of your vision, the blind spot is just to the side of the vision. And what you don't see in the blind spot of one eye is made up for in the other eye. And if you design it that way, versus if you put the optic nerve right in the middle, then we would all have a blind spot right in the middle of our eye. So again, this points to an intelligent design, and what we and scientists may think is, okay, this is maybe not the optimal way to design an eye, is actually the optimal way for the eye to be designed. So I have just a couple of minutes. I will just close with a quote of Hazrat Khalifa Rabwah, who is the author of Revelation, Rationality, Knowledge, and Truth, who says that the whole optic system frustrates all attempts by the modern scientist to fully understand it. No man-made optic or auditory system comprising the three organs we have discussed can ever match the intricacies of these amazing coordinated machines. This should have been the area of the naturalist research to discover which forces play a creative, harmonious role. That is what they do not attempt, perhaps because evidently the fingers of these composite systems would be raised in the direction of God and not in the direction of Darwin, unquote. And the last quote I would share with you is from Hazur's address at the inaugural Ahmadiyya Muslim Research Association's conference in 2019, where Hazur says, when a believer studies and ponders over the celestial bodies and the entire universe, it causes their minds to open up and for them to become enlightened. The result is that they are led towards a firm belief in the existence of God Almighty as they see the signs and evidence for His existence all around them, unquote. In the last 30 seconds, I'll just address the question, Dr. Saab, if that's okay, that was asked about the eye. So when Dr. Sohail Hussain Saab was talking about pancreatic regeneration, somebody on the ladies' side asked a question about, is there research towards regeneration or healing within the trabecular meshwork, which is the drain of the eye, which can lead to glaucoma when it's damaged? And the answer is, the holy grail of science right now is stem cells. So if you can take embryonic stem cells and then you can place them in the diseased part of any part of the body and you can get it to regenerate, then yes, you can provide a lot of different cures. So there's a tremendous amount of stem cell research that is going into implanting these cells within the trabecular meshwork of the human eye. And currently, one of the treatments that we do for glaucoma is something called SLT, or selective laser treatment, where we actually apply laser to the meshwork with a lens, and that actually causes remodeling of the meshwork to lower the pressure. So that is basically a short answer to that question. Jazakallah.